All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to session one, The Role of Leadership in a Pandemic, by Alex and Anira. My name is Georgia, and I will be moderating this session. Before we start, we're going to go over some logistical information with Zoom. So first, we ask that you change your Zoom name just so it has your first name. In terms of recording, please note the session is being recorded, and we're also live streaming it on Facebook. So if you don't consent to this, please leave this meeting. We kindly ask that you mute yourself when you're not speaking so we can minimize distractions. We also recommend that viewers put the screen in speaker view so you can see the presentation and everyone that is speaking. If you have any questions or comments that come up in the presentation and you have access to the chatting capability, please send them privately to me by selecting moderator in the field of the chat box. Students, there may be times throughout the presentation when the presenters will ask comments from the audience. So during these times, do not use the chat. Instead, please either raise your hand in front of your video and indicate that you would like to speak, or just come up to the D10 and share. And I will call on you by name or the room number, and you can speak then and present to the rest of the group. I will now turn the presentation over to our presenters, Alex and Anira. Thank you so much, and we hope you enjoy.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Alex.
And my name is Anira.
And this is our bioethics project titled The Role of Leadership in a Pandemic. We will be exploring the ethics regarding the obligations of health organizations in developed countries to citizens on a global scale. This is the intersection of our two topics which we've researched this whole year. I studied the role and responsibility of the CDC through an ethical lens, and Anira studied the relationships between developed nations and developing nations in relation to health rights.
So before we go into our topic, when talking about health rights and health justice, we find it important to really preface that we're working off of the assumption that all of us engaging in this conversation and this workshop here today want to protect and improve health rights and provide justice, both locally and globally, because we all have an obligation to ensure health rights just as citizens and as human beings. And then expanding larger, we wanted to look specifically at the role of government in a health crisis and the nuances associated with that decision making. Therefore, the question which streamlined our research was, what is the role of government to citizens and the role of government on a global scale in a health crisis?
So before we got into our ethical analysis, I wanted to provide some background information about what we will be discussing regarding the WHO and the CDC. The WHO stands for the World Health Organization, which functions to serve the health of all citizens worldwide. WHO works worldwide to promote health, keep the world safe, and serve the vulnerable. The CDC, however, is unique to the United States. It serves the health of all American citizens. The CDC's mission statement reads, "We work 24/7 to protect the safety, health, and security of America from threats here and around the world." The ethical question that arises from the coexistence and collaboration of both the CDC and the WHO is, how is the balance maintained? So based on this question, the CDC and the WHO, they work to serve the health of all citizens, but in what ways are American citizens' health prioritized, and when should the health of worldwide citizens be prioritized, if any?
And then in terms of defining developed versus developing countries, it's important to highlight that the definition that I use to streamline my research really focuses on the health infrastructures of the countries and then the corresponding relationships between both nations. So for developed countries, the definition is that a developed country is a state that has a developed economy and an advanced technological infrastructure relative to other less industrialized nations. And then for a developing country, that they are a country with a less developed industrial base and a low human development index context relative to other countries. And it's also important to note that these definitions that are provided here are really not universally agreed upon, but for the purpose of our discussion today, we're going to be looking at a developed nation as one that has an advanced health infrastructure, and a developing nation is one that does not. And I think this image that's here is an image of Bangladesh of the infamous factory collapse. This very clearly represents the dynamic that currently stands in our global economic order between developed and developing nations. So developed nations such as the US have implemented factories in Bangladesh or developing nations with very exploitative practices. And what this leads to is developing nations are essentially extremely dependent on developed nations. Their economies are intertwined. And for this reason, developed nations are then able to use exploitative practices to leverage over these countries. And this results really in a lack of health infrastructure for developing countries, along with a lack of economic infrastructure. And as pictured here, this factory collapse was not only devastating because it proved that there were exploitative practices without any regulations being occurred in developing countries, but also because citizens had virtually no access or right to health. There was no health infrastructure to really help those that were injured. And therefore, it really exposed the kind of skewed power dynamic that exists currently between both nations. And then before we get into our ethical analysis and some of our case studies, we really wanted to ground our discussion in the Declaration of Human Rights and the rights that are really guaranteed to all humans, regardless of where they live and regardless of their geographical location. The first being that everyone is equally entitled to the potential to flourish. Alex and I interpreted this as the potential to flourishment in terms of health and having agency over one's health. And then Article 25, that everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, and housing, which really intersects, you'll see as we explore our topics. Health really intersects with access to many other forms and protections of life.
So to provide some background information into what Anira and I have studied this year, we wanted to provide you with 2 case studies that really encapsulate what we've been studying. So we wanted to poll you first to figure out what you think before we go into our ethical analysis. So Anira can start.
Yeah, so this is the first poll. You can scan it using your phone, and then you should be taken to a link to ask with the question asking regarding new variances in COVID-19. So if a new variant is to emerge, do you think it is ethical for the CDC in terms of looking locally at the United States to withhold information from the citizens if they are to be discovered in terms of looking at their role in the government? And I will let you guys know the results, and then we'll have a little bit of a discussion. I'll give you some time to answer. All right.
For anyone who doesn't know how to scan a QR code, you're just going to open the camera app on your phone, and then it'll send you to a Safari or whatever web browser you use.
Okay. So it's looking like the majority are 96% said no, it is unethical for the CDC to withhold information, and roughly 4% said yes, it is ethical. So would anyone who has said no, would they like to unmute and provide their rationale?
Or on the flip side, if anyone said yes, does anyone want to share their reasoning for that?
I said yes. I indicated yes because I feel that there is a role for the CDC to withhold information if it's going to cause a public panic, or if there's incomplete information, and there may be larger issues like the security of the country, which may require the withholding of information.
Thank you so much. And that's definitely something, the point you brought up about distrust and public panic is definitely something that Alex is going to later expand on in her topic. So next we have another poll, if you could scan that. And this relates to my case study regarding the Ebola epidemic. So during the Ebola epidemic, many Americans in West Africa were airlifted out and treated with experimental therapies that those in West Africa did not receive. And the question asks if it was ethical for America to do this and to take Americans out. It's really a question of national autonomy and whether or not that should affect the ethics of a situation. All right, so this one is looking a little more split than the previous one. So 68% said no, it was unethical, and 32% said yes. So would anyone on either side like to unmute and provide their rationale?
So there's no right or wrong answer to this. So if anyone's scared that they're going to be wrong, it's everyone's opinion is valid and there's reasoning for every point of view.
I can start. I said it was ethical because each nation state has the agency right to take care of its citizens and do the best that they can do, especially the citizens who had gone to a difficult place for human services and put their lives in danger. So it's almost a responsibility for agent or nation states to support those citizens.
Thank you so much. Okay, so now we're going to go into Alex and I's analysis of the case studies.
Okay, so one of my case studies revolved around the question, is it ethical for the CDC to withhold information regarding new variants or strains or vaccines? So I just wanted to preface this with the CDC's job. The CDC's job is to protect the well-being. So the question arises, would it harm the public and the CDC's reputation to release possibly premature or unsure information about new variants or the vaccine rollout? So as everyone knows, COVID-19 is a new virus with new strains and variants developing worldwide. The only thing every health organization and citizen worldwide can hold true is that they are still figuring things out as they come their way. There is no way for the CDC to get information of something before it occurs. So what should be the timeline in which information is relayed to the public in a timely yet safe manner? I believe the CDC should be primarily concerned first about the health and safety of the citizens of the United States. To prevent the spread of new strains and to vaccinate as many people as possible is the main goal. So why is this an ethical issue? So the CDC could be concerned about their credibility if they release information prematurely. If it was later found to be completely untrue, then members of the United States could lose trust in the CDC and possibly other government agencies. The release of partial information or miscommunication to the American citizens regarding vital information could create mass panic. With only partial information, many citizens could jump to very dangerous conclusions that could cause other citizens to become panicked or frightened for their own safety. In contrast, if the CDC did not release any information to the public, many citizens would find misinformation or become angry with the lack of any transparency whatsoever, and the CDC's reputation could also be at risk in this situation. Citizens also, with the lack of knowledge, could feel as though their safety and autonomy has been ignored and their voice has been deemed unimportant from the government. So I believe that the CDC should find the correct balance of transparency and provide citizens with all the information for them to make their best informed decision and also preserve a sense of personal autonomy. With that being said, it is also important that safety is preserved for the nation and for the world as a whole. If the CDC does withhold information, it's likely with the intention of maintaining general safety. This, however, can bring up a sense of paternalism, which Anira will touch on later, but this sense of paternalism must be contained.
All right, and then going into my case study regarding the Ebola epidemic, there's really 4 ways to categorize the ethics of the Ebola epidemic. Those being firstly that it was a containable outbreak. The second was the ethical issue of equitable distribution of resources. The third being allocation based on nationality, which we touched on in the poll. And lastly, the conduction of research. So starting off, in a lot of my research, ethicists pointed out that the proximal causes of what could have been a very easily containable outbreak went out of control because of a lack of health infrastructures. And this exposed that there is a failure to recognize global inequalities in health infrastructures as urgent. And this leads, and this could have arguably been the root cause of the EVD outbreak and the inability to maintain it in a way that would have preserved the health of citizens. Next, there was the issue of equitable distribution of resources and whether or not there should have been a risk to healthcare workers globally. So what I mean by this is there were many humanitarian organizations which came in during the crisis to help and aid. However, the need for them really outstripped their ability to respond effectively. And this raised the question of how should resources in terms of healthcare workers be allocated? And should there have been a risk to those in nations and countries outside of West Africa, and whether or not they had a heightened obligation to work towards that distribution of resources? Then there was the issue of allocation based on nationality, which during the crisis, many Americans were airlifted out of West Africa and treated with many experimental therapies, which those in West Africa did not receive. And those who were dying did not get the opportunity to receive. And it really raises the question of ethical standards of nationality. And I think many parallels can be drawn to our COVID pandemic in terms of seeing which countries have access to vaccines, which countries have the higher buying power in order to ensure that they can get a certain amount of vaccines for their citizens, and whether or not that poses a threat if you're looking at allocation based on nationality in terms of being a global citizen and having a global mindset. And then lastly, there was the issue of a conduction of research for the treatment of Ebola. Who would participate in those trials? And whether or not the standards of care should differ based on the context regarding who would participate. For example, would care be different if a healthcare worker from a developed nation contracted Ebola and offered to participate in the trial versus one from a developing nation? Should there be different standards of care, and how should we weigh that in terms of our ethical analysis?
So it's important when we're speaking about leadership to first define what a leader is. So thinking of the question, what does it mean to be a leader? Please use the chat function, raise your hand or unmute, and share some characteristics that you believe defines a good leader. And again, there are no wrong answers.
Okay,
I
I
can
got
go, Alex.
the
Oh.
value of integrity. So I think that's really important when we're talking about leadership.
I have some participation in the chat. So we have willingness to take tough decisions. We have compromise and empathy are some of the qualities that come to mind first. And then we also have decisiveness. Oh, and humility.
Well, thank you everyone for your participation. I definitely agree with all of those characteristics. So using these characteristics and previously developed ideas of what a good leader is, thinking of the question, globally, do developed nations, because of privilege, have more responsibility to help developing countries? So through our ethical analysis, Anira and I both believe that developed nations have a responsibility to help developing countries. Using the values of safety and justice in relation to the importance of being a global citizen, every human, regardless of nationality, is entitled to safe and affordable healthcare. And to preserve worldwide health, it is important not to have a nationalistic lens. With this applicable knowledge, we can also look at locally, do health organizations, because of knowledge, have more responsibility to its citizens? Again, Anira and I both believe that health organizations have a responsibility to act in the citizens, whether it be worldwide or for a specific nation, best interest. Through consequentialism, the actions and outcomes of health organizations, specifically the WHO and the CDC, should reflect the immense responsibility to citizen safety and health to provide the resources and opportunities to all citizens. However, each individual has the right to his, her, or their own autonomy. And although they have access to said resources, it is in the individual's own hands to determine further action and to seek or not seek, or to follow or not follow what the WHO, CDC, or another health organization may recommend.
So now we're going to go into our ethical analysis of this topic, and we mainly use the principle of justice, the value of responsibility, and the theory of consequentialism to streamline our understanding of these global and local issues. So I'm firstly going to talk about the value of justice, and justice is also a principle. And the basis that I found in a lot of my research and my understanding and analyzing at least my topic is that deprivations and health rights are truly unjust because they reduce the capability for health functioning and an exercisation of agency. And this is really why the principle of justice appeals to all of us and to all humans regardless of where they live, because the human of life must be fundamentally treated equally. So when we're looking at global justice, as on the right, it is important to note that this is really intertwined with a legal lens. So currently there's little to no legal obligations or requirements to ensure global health justice and really this sense of moral responsibility. And this raises the question of what systems should we put in place? And one of these systems that has been proposed is global health law. However, this raises a lot of ethical dilemmas of would this be feasible given national autonomy and sovereignty? And would one national governance law even be plausible with the systems that we have in place today? And additionally, when you're looking at global justice and how should we protect the health rights of citizens, the WHO really can take an active role in ensuring global health justice. They can either guideline health rights and protect them and encourage developed nations to aid in the development of health infrastructures for developing nations. Furthermore, justice really implies that these resources should be available to all on an equal basis. So thus, developing nations will really need actually more resources in comparison to others in order to combat with their lack of infrastructures. And then going off of this idea of allocation of resources, we must recognize that justice really isn't as simple as an allocation of resources when we're looking at distributive justice and the question of shared resources and information in a pandemic. And as the question here states, justice would imply that all would have the same resources in order to ensure a just and equitable society. However, this really prevails to ignore that not all countries have the same access to resources which allow them to utilize this information. So we might often just shift obligation towards giving developing countries medical treatments or vaccines, but ensuring access to these vaccines or these resources is of limited use if they don't have efficient systems in place to ensure an efficient distribution. For example, giving 100 vaccines to a developing nation which may not have the amount of nurses and the health infrastructure needed to deliver that to that citizens could lead to actually a precedent of those vaccines not being utilized and the rights of those citizens even further being diminished. So due to this, there's really a heightened need for justice and health infrastructures to be achieved, as these are issues that undermine the effectiveness of any treatment. And thus, distributive justice and shared resources is really only effective when all countries are on the same basis of health infrastructures. And then going a little bit into responsibility and the role of governments and developed nations locally and globally, we see that there is a sense of global responsibility, perhaps more prominently placed on developed nations to take initiative in creating systems that will give justice to those who are currently being deprived of their right to flourishment. And this responsibility can be simply just defined as a responsibility to protect health rights, as opposed to sort of this self-centered view of responsibility to help others solely because one is more advantaged, right? As citizens, we should have more of a global outlook and an individual basis and stake in ensuring health rights. And it's really important that we're careful of descending down the slippery slope of feeling burdened, whether it's locally in trying to solve or trying to be educated about disparities in healthcare, or globally when we're looking at someone who may live across an ocean from us and is not getting the same accessibility to treatment. And many might argue that nations will feel burdened with helping others and that they have national autonomy to pursue what they wish. But this argument of burden and national autonomy really fails, because in a pandemic and a health crisis, we're really only as strong as our weakest link. And ensuring health rights for developing nations is in essence ensuring health rights for all. And so I personally believe that countries and organizations and health organizations should recognize burden as self-interest and actually work towards trying to fulfill their responsibility in reducing global inequalities. And one way to implement this justice in the form of responsibility is through the concept of shared responsibility, which necessitates collaboration and the sharing of information. So whether that be locally with the CDC, you can see that responsibility can be placed on them to share information within their sectors and to consult others in order for a more holistic understanding to arise in the benefit of the citizens, and then globally with making sure that all countries have some sort of same basis of information to work off of.
So I'm going to build off the value of responsibility. So I think it's also important to look through the value of responsibility at the question, are health care organizations more responsible for providing complete transparency or promoting a sense of safety? And how do we weigh both of these in an effort to strike the right balance? So please raise your hand, unmute, or turn to your neighbor and share what you think. And again, there are no wrong answers.
Hi. I think healthcare organizations are more responsible for providing complete transparency, just because, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, with all these new strains, it has caused a lot of people to say, you know, I've gotten COVID before, maybe I won't take the vaccine now, but it's also like, but okay, yes, but that's only temporary immunity, whereas the vaccine could give you more immunity. And, you know, it can sometimes justify actions that aren't really ethical if you don't have the full story from the CDC.
Yeah, thank you so much for your participation. I don't completely agree. I agree with what you were saying. And if anyone else doesn't have anything, I can go into my other hands.
I was just going to say that I agree that transparency is more important because a sense of safety doesn't equate to actual safety. And if by providing honesty, people are able to prepare themselves rather than be left in the dark on something that can completely alter their lives as they know them.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sadie. And I think Lauren was raising her hand.
Hey, I just wanted to say, in my opinion, how I'm thinking of this, creating a sense of safety is going to be different for everyone. So different people have different judgments on what is safe or not. So I feel like it's more important and they should be more responsible to provide a feeling of transparency or provide transparency, just because other people are going to interpret different things as safe or not safe.
Thank you so much for everyone for your participation, and I'm just making sure no one else has their hand raised. So I'm going to dive into my ethical analysis. So I believe health organizations have the responsibility. I believe health organizations have the responsibility to act in the best interests of citizens worldwide or specific to the United States. However, complete transparency could create mass panic and therefore act against the greatest amount of good. Health organizations, however, have a responsibility to inform the public and citizens regarding all the important information to have informed consent. However, this leads down a slippery slope that, again, Anira will touch on regarding paternalism. To find the best solution, health organizations need to find the correct balance to maintain a healthy relationship with the public. So this allows the public to trust in their best interests, and it also keeps health organizations from lacking transparent representation of public voice or opinion by providing no transparency whatsoever. The relationship between health organizations such as the CDC and the American public is vital for trust, because without the trust, that there's no credibility of what the CDC is saying. And we could also look at it through the frame, do organizations such as the CDC have a responsibility to share protocols, resources, or possible vaccines with less developed nations or information to their citizens? Is it ethical to maintain a nationalist lens? So the CDC is not meant to only act in the best interest of the United States citizens. It's meant to act in the best interest of the world as a whole, meaning worldwide citizens. They also carry the responsibility to provide essential resources, information, possible vaccines or treatments to developing nations. And as Anira touched on before, just because it is a distribution of these resources, it should also have accessibility to administer and just equal access across the board, which may lead to added resources to developing nations. This provides the nations with their own autonomy to act in what they view as their personal best interests. Therefore, the CDC does have an unwritten responsibility, but must maintain a balance, similar to what I spoke in the previous slide, of worldwide safety and autonomy on both an individual and national level. Oh, sorry. So I'm going to be looking through this through the ethical lens of consequentialism. Consequentialism is an ethical theory which we studied in bioethics class in depth. It determines the ethicality of actions based off their consequences, not based off their intentions. So it is also necessary to recognize the privilege that health organizations such as the CDC have regarding access to resources, the ability to research, and having a platform and to be viewed as a trustworthy information source. However, it is also important to preface that everyone is still learning as they go through this pandemic together, and the only way to overcome mass tragedy is to work together. And as Anira said before, we are only as strong as our weakest link. But it is also necessary to consider the factor of the reputation of the CDC. The CDC, if they lack transparency or provide misinformation, is at risk for citizen distrust, which again could lead to mass hysteria if they continue. Additionally, the CDC has to hold themselves accountable for the power they maintain. Not providing enough information could lead to the notion that the CDC or another government agency is not a good leader and is not holding themselves accountable to share this information with the public. It is also necessary to recognize the precedent of inequity and injustice in all health organizations worldwide and in the United States. If actions are taken in an effort to try to not set a precedent of inequity and injustice in a system that already has that precedent, would it be equal?
So next, as Alex has touched on, I'm going to look at the subfacet of consequentialism that we really want to acknowledge in this discussion, which is paternalism. And it's important to define paternalism. So essentially, by my understanding, paternalism is the act of parties with privilege in a situation making decisions about those subordinate to them in their supposed best interest. And it's really rooted in privilege and power dynamics, which then has the negative consequence of limiting autonomy for many. So this graphic here, I think, does a really effective job of listing what paternalism is. So you have a governmental figure on the left stating you just can't be trusted with making medical decisions, leave that to us. You have a doctor saying that they are a board certified MD and they have the knowledge to do so. And then the patient stating that it is their own body. So what this encompasses is that in many of the systems, unfortunately, that are present today, paternalism is extremely present. We have situations or we have entities which often act in the supposed best interest of the people. But what this does is really limits one's own autonomy to make decisions about their own safety and their own health. And this really leads down a slippery slope. So does anyone want to unmute and just share if they have any experience with paternalism or if they know of instances where it can occur?
It occurs in like the white man's burden that we learned about in history that's like rooted in paternalism.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that's definitely a really important concept, and that really directly relates to the dynamic we see now between developed and developing nations in terms of looking at colonialism and expansion.
And I think going off of Maggie, it's also present in what we see as the United States trying to preserve democracy worldwide. So their imperialist views are like in theory paternalistic, because even though they are trying to preserve democracy, it is for their own best interest.
Okay, so now I can go into a little bit of how paternalism applies to the cases we're discussing here today. So there could be really a precedent set if we put an extreme responsibility on the privileged entities, whether that be health organizations or whether that be developed nations, and that being of paternalism. So it's really important that we give a sense of autonomy to citizens in the case of government, and that paternalism doesn't hold as a governing principle. And I think this pandemic has exposed to us more than ever that there is a lot of distrust in the government government's decision, and some believe that they're making decisions based off of paternalism, and some invalidate science in that sense. So there's really a distinction, Alex and I believe, between making a scientific call and a paternalistic one. So citizens really should be kept at the forefront of decisions. They should be given autonomy when they can, but it's important not to impose practices that one entity sees as the best fit. So in a pandemic, really science and health rights is the most ethical and important. So we really want to debunk that making a decision off of science is paternalistic. We're more so looking at how one uses their privilege to leverage over other people. And then even more prominently, I think paternalism applies with developed nations. And it's important that they're really not paternalistic in implementing health procedures or even aiding in developing countries. So developed countries have an obligation to ensure, first and foremost, informed consent in international research. So when you're looking at countries which are different and have perhaps different values than the supposed Western ideals. So in Western ideals, a lot of emphasis is given to individual autonomy. However, in many developing countries, there's a sense of communal decision making and different cultural boundaries, which may not highlight individual autonomy in the same sense. So we have to make sure that we respect decisions made by others, even if we culturally disagree with them. We should give people the opportunity and the resource to act in their best interest, but we can never impose that, because that's a really slippery slope if we were to exploit others solely because what we see as best fit is not what another sees as best fit. So implementing paternalism, whether it's in the government, whether it's locally and globally, could really lead to distrust with citizens and an already skewed by dynamic, which would prevent people to have really agency over their own life and their own medical decisions. Just to conclude, we believe that based on the principle of justice, value of responsibility, along with the theory of consequentialism, with the subfacet of paternalism, the role of leadership in a pandemic is really dependent on numerous factors. In providing the most ethical course of action for the protection of health rights, it's important that we don't ignore the crisis of health rights globally as they stand now, and the potential of human life to be valued and ranked based on geographical location. And furthermore, when we're looking at local governments, the responsibility is even more prominently weighed on them to weigh the outcomes of their decisions. And as there is really a potential for distrust or panic with the public, along with their credibility. And we have to look at the autonomy of citizens and highlight that as a prerogative, while also ensuring that their health rights are protected. And we all as global citizens need to discuss these issues. So all of you engaging in this conversation with us today is really a good first step in looking at how can we provide justice for health rights that are being diminished, especially in an age of COVID-19. And it's crucial that with those we place in power, whether it's governments or those that, in terms of a global scale, those that are in power because they have higher means or more privilege, are governed by ethical principles and that they're acting with ethics in mind. So thank you so much for listening today. I'll now transfer it back to Georgia to lead into the Q&A period.
Okay, thank you. And thank you so much to Alex and Anira for a really interesting presentation. I definitely learned a lot, and your topic is obviously so relevant today. So in terms of questions, we have about 10 minutes. If you have a question or comment, feel free to raise your hand or come up to your D10 and I will call on you, or private chat me in the chat box and I can also read out those questions. So it looks like we already have a couple questions coming in. I will start with this one. So how does the United States serve as an example for the rest of the world? And how does that affect the weight on the US government?
Okay, I can start. So what I really learned while researching all about the CDC and the role of America is the precedent that it sets for the rest of the world. So being a worldwide citizen is also as a reflection of your own personal nation. So as the United States, I feel as though it's really important to recognize the power that the CDC holds. So it is also important to recognize that the United States is, because of its unwritten responsibility to developing nations, should be able to share the resources or information to developing nations. And I think Anira can more develop on that idea.
Yeah, I definitely think the United States serves as a pillar, for example, in any given response for a pandemic. We have been placed in a position of power as a developed nation. And I think the world generally does look to see how we respond in an age of crisis. And for that reason, I think it's actually even more important that the US, as this figure, governs by ethical principles, because And I think that may be an undue burden on them that they are being watched by everyone. But if they are to set a precedent of acting unethically or not adhering to the pillar of justice, I think that could have a trickle down effect in terms of influencing many other nations as well.
Okay, thank you. And we have more questions in the chat box, but again, feel free to come up to the D10s. So another question we have is, what do you think about the ethics of requiring all those traveling on planes to get the vaccine?
So when I first read that question, what I first thought of was personal autonomy. So I know many who do not believe in the vaccine believe that it is their own personal autonomy to decide what is right for their body, and that a government could not necessarily enforce someone to get a vaccine. However, many colleges are requiring students who are coming back to campus to get vaccines. So I feel as though there's a responsibility as a worldwide citizen to do everything in your power to keep the world safe, especially during a crisis like a pandemic that we are in now. So it is the responsibility of your own individual person to act in the best interest of the whole world and not just your personal autonomy.
And I also think many might say that traveling is a privilege in and of itself. And so if you have the privilege to travel, then therefore you should take the added measures, whether that be getting a vaccine to ensure the safety of the citizens of the nation to which you are traveling. And I think that is a very valid argument, ethical argument when you're looking at this case. But I think that also ignores, I guess, the nuances of people who have to travel for their jobs and who may have to travel overseas to see their family members, and those which are not really they're not really privileged and individual decisions. Those are requirements. And how do we really manage individual autonomy in forcing someone to get a vaccine, or should we rather prevail that autonomy? Because I know in a lot of actually developing countries, there is a sense that of cultural norms which actually oppose the vaccine. So would those members then not be able to travel to the US or any other developed nations if we were to impose that?
Okay, we have D10 number 113. They have their hand up.
So my question is, do you think that the sense of responsibility that developed nations hold can be clouded or paired with a sense of superiority?
I think that's a really good question. I think that was one of the things I struggled with in my research. Is off the bat, there is already this power dynamic that developed nations have. And I think a lot of what came up was that the US or developed nations have a sense of superiority complex. I think that dates back to times of colonialism in which they felt they had the right to go expand and colonize many nations simply because they were superior. And I think it's important when we're looking at health rights that there's a distinction between an obligation to ensure health rights and to value human life equally, and then a separate self-interest of developed nations who think they are superior and going in because they feel that they have the right solution. I think it would be hard for us to talk about health rights, which are such fundamental aspects of being a human being and how your life is valued and whether or not you can pursue life, if we were to go down a superiority complex. So while I do believe it's an important thing to acknowledge, I think that when we're looking at health rights, it more so pertains to developed nations having an obligation because they have the infrastructures to provide for their citizens, making sure that globally we don't set a precedent that someone's life in another country because they don't have the health infrastructure is valued less.
Yeah, and Naira really just took the words out of my brain. That's exactly what I was going to say. But I also think what we touched upon before is that every human, regardless of your nation or regardless of any identifier, should have equal access to safe and affordable healthcare. And I feel like that is really conflicted with the sense of superiority from a lot of different developed nations, which I like many would not like it to be a reality, but it is a reality. And I think it's also important to recognize that.
Okay, D10 number 231, you can go.
Hey, okay, so Anara, in the beginning, you kind of gave your definition of developing and developed places. So I was just wondering if you like changed your definition, like made it narrower or broader, how you think your values or like your conclusions would have changed if they would have changed at all.
Yeah, I think when I first started my research and I first chose this topic, I was just initially sparked by the interest of what developed nations have in a pandemic and the global inequalities that were kind of overshadowed. A lot of countries during the pandemic actually suffered a lot, and they did not have the resources. So I think I just off the bat was really interested to research why that occurred and why developed nations didn't take a more active role. So I think my definition. The one that I used is really the conventional definition that we typically, I guess, use in like historical research, that being of infrastructure. But I think over the course of my research, it changed to evolve as when you're looking at health of citizens. So I think regardless of an industrial base or the economic order, I think I was more so looking at the definition specifically when you're looking at health infrastructures, even though those are intertwined. One could argue that one's economic means is intertwined with their ability to provide healthcare for their citizens. I just think I looked more at that dynamic between both.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to read a question in the chat. Since the CDC is not just ethically responsible for the health of American citizens, should the CDC be providing more foreign aid to other countries struggling in the COVID pandemic? How much responsibility does the CDC have to help other countries or nation states?
So, although we may not like it, the CDC has recently had more of a focus on the United States citizens. And although because of the privilege and the responsibility that they have been supplying all these different resources and information, but due to the circumstances, I personally don't think that they have been living up to the fullest potential. And I think that they do have a responsibility to citizens worldwide to provide them with that sense of autonomy and options and accessibility, as I touched on before.
Yeah, and I think that obligation can be extended. We are seeing that actually 86% of vaccines, I believe, went to high and middle income countries, with only 0.1% of vaccines going to low income countries. So whether it's the CDC or health organizations of developed nations looking at their buying power and seeing that perhaps we are limiting the ability for other countries to get the vaccine, perhaps we're gaining an abundance of it, and then sort of diminishing the right of these countries, I think they have an obligation worldwide in a pandemic. Even if you solve the root of COVID-19 within your own country, if that COVID-19 exists in another country, it's going to round back to your own just because of the globalized nature of our society as it stands now. So it's just really important that we don't just solely pertain a responsibility to one's own citizens, although that is their primary obligation. We also look globally.
Okay, thank you so much to our presenters and to everyone who participated. We hope you enjoyed this workshop. So our next one is going to start at 10:50, so we're going to take a quick 5-minute break. You can stay on this Zoom link for the next session,